welcome back. Today we are looking at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, chapters 3 and 4. But before we get into our study of this part of the book, I'd like to thank all of my patrons who have helped make videos like this possible. Thank you so much for your support. And if you haven't checked out my Patreon page yet, I recommend you head over there and check it out, because not only do you get to support me making great videos like this one, but you also get to have all kinds of extra resources. For example, I have guided questions over Frankenstein that I'm making available to my patrons. Previously in our Frankenstein discussions, we've looked at how Victor Frankenstein, as a young man, was in need of good friends to help mold him and help move his character in the right direction. This book emphasizes the dangerous pursuits of ambition from that passionate kind of personality that Victor has. But as long as he was around Elizabeth and Henry, that ambition was curbed and turned into something more noble and good, by their good qualities rubbing off on him. However, his downward trend begins in chapter 3. He's 17 years old and he's getting ready to go off to college, but before he does so, tragedy strikes his family. First of all, Elizabeth catches scarlet fever, which was incredibly deadly back in the day. She's very sick, but she's nursed back to health by Victor's mother, Caroline. However, Victor's mother then catches the scarlet fever and she succumbs. As she's dying, she wishes that Elizabeth and Victor would one day be married and live happily. The death of Victor's mother is of course a heartbreaking moment for Victor, and he sees it as the mark of things to come. This tragedy, this grief and loss, are going to set him down a negative trajectory for the rest of his life. It foreshadows many other scenes of grief and loss that he's going to experience. Remember, this entire story is told from the older Victor's perspective. He has already been through all of this, and so he's looking back at it retrospectively, and sometimes reading things into certain moments. This moment of loss also causes Victor to reflect on the nature of life and death, and it gives him a reason to ponder that in the coming years, which is also going to trigger perhaps a desire to defeat death through science. Although this loss is hard for Victor and his family, ultimately he still decides to go off to school in Ingolstadt, and he says goodbye to his friends and family and heads off into a new world. However, he's pretty pessimistic as he travels to Ingolstadt, and what he says and reflects on as he is riding there is significant and ties in with a lot of the themes we've already been talking about. I, who had ever been surrounded by amiable companions, continually engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure, I was now alone. In the university, whither I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old, familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. The book has already repeated over and over and over the significance of companions and friends on tempering us and keeping us from our dangerous excesses. And here is Victor's first experience going away from those he loves, away from those who have been such a good influence on him, to see what will become of him without anyone there to guide and help him. Spoilers, it doesn't go well. He arrives at the college, and over the next few days he meets two key professors. The first is Monsieur Krempe. Monsieur Krempe is a blunt and uncouth man who is described as being stout and repugnant. Not a particularly pleasant guy, and he in fact mocks Victor because of Victor's interest in the old alchemy writings of Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa. Victor's interest in their fantastical ideas is not real science, and Monsieur Krempe just mocks him. Of course, Victor had already given up on Cornelius Agrippa, and so as he walks away, it was no real loss. However, Monsieur Krempe does introduce him to the lectures of Monsieur Waldman, who is going to have a significant impact on Victor. Victor attends one of Monsieur Waldman's lectures on chemistry, and as he's listening to him, he is completely inspired by this. Especially because Monsieur Waldman draws the key, the connection between Victor's old studies and his future ambitions. Monsieur Waldman talks about how the great writers and thinkers of the past, these alchemists, who Victor was very interested in, promised great miracles, eternal life, turning lead into gold, these kinds of things. And yet they never produced anything. Modern science promises only mundane things. It only looks at everyday things. And yet it has discovered great wonders and miracles, in fact. This moves Victor deeply, and Victor goes to speak to Monsieur Waldman, who kindly says that the things that he's read built the foundation for future science, and although he lacks education, if he applies himself, he has great potential to become something really phenomenal. And so encouraged, Victor begins intensive study in natural philosophy, particularly in chemistry. I want to pause here for just a moment, because as Victor introduces these two professors, he makes an interesting claim that ties in with something he said at the end of chapter 2. The next morning, I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door, led me first to Monsieur Krempe, professor of natural philosophy. So he says this sort of overblown and dramatic statement, which is, again, a very romantic kind of thing, deeply emotional, supernatural, kind of over the top. But it ties in with what he said at the end of chapter 2, where he talks about this guardian angel that was trying to protect him and trying to steer him away from natural philosophy by pulling him back from those studies after he watched the lightning strike the tree. Here, an opposing force, an evil angel, an evil influence, the angel of destruction, pushes him into meeting Monsieur Krempe and then ultimately back into the study of natural philosophy. Although his description of this as a force, a supernatural force that's pushing him one way, pushing him another way, kind of like the angel and the devil on the shoulder. What this indicates about Victor is that he doesn't fully take responsibility for his actions. He seems to attribute the moments in his life to these divine and supernatural forces, things that take away from his free will to make decisions and to feel responsible for them. Victor's going to do something really bad very soon, and it's going to lead to dire consequences. And so, to some extent, it's almost as if he is trying to release himself from responsibility for that by attributing it to destiny, to forces of an angel of destruction, and not his own choice to let his studies run away with him. He's relied all too heavily on the positive influences of Elizabeth and Henry so far in his life. And when alone, he doesn't take responsibility for his actions and steer himself aright. His description of Monsieur Waldman's words in the lecture and the impact they had upon him are similar. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such were the words of fate announced to destroy me. As he went on, I felt as if my soul were grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched, which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much has been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more will I achieve, treading in the steps already marked. I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. Clearly he's inspired, and his ambition flares intensely as he listens to the things that Monsieur Waldman says. However, we can see also that it's as if some sort of force is taking over him, this enemy that is constructing the mechanism of his desire, that then ultimately plays out into the disaster that's coming. It's not my fault. A palpable enemy touched one by one the various keys of the mechanism of my being. What was I supposed to do about that? Alas, alas. In chapter 3, Victor Frankenstein dives into his studies wholeheartedly. In fact, quite too much. He obsesses as he strives to become the greatest, and within just 2 years he rises above everyone, even above his professors. He becomes master of all different types of natural philosophy and begins to better the university through his discoveries. After 2 years, he's about ready to go home and finally get back with those friends who might be able to curb some of his obsession, when all of a sudden he makes a discovery. In the middle of digging around through life and death and worms and rot, he discovers the secret to life. how to bestow life on inanimate matter. And because of this, suddenly his obsession cranks up to 11, and he decides not to go home, but to experiment and explore this new discovery further. He wants to bring something to life. And not just anything, he wants to bring a perfect man to life. Let's not start with something small, like a toad or something. Let's make a whole man who will then call me a father, and will love me as a creator. So you can see how his ambition is turned into this overweening pride, this hubris. Right about in here, Victor breaks from his story to talk directly to Captain Walton. Remember who Captain Walton is? He's the character who's found Victor Frankenstein washed up on a block of ice out in the Arctic from our frame story in the letters before the chapters actually begin. And of course, this entire book is Victor telling the story to Captain Walton, to refresh our memory that this is the Victor who's seeing things from the perspective of the end of the story. He addresses Walton specifically. "I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow." He pauses here to drive home the moral. Do not let your ambition outrun your nature. If you strive to do things beyond the boundary of what's good for humanity, you will regret it. Clearly, Walton has that kinship with Frankenstein, and as he hears these wonders that Frankenstein accomplished, he begins to fill with his own energy as he's listening to Victor tell the story. But Victor's like, calm down, man. This is not the right path. This is bad. Just wait till you hear how bad this is going to go for me. After Victor goes down this path of studying life and the creation of life, things get a whole lot worse for him, rather obviously. His body and his mind deteriorate under the strain and the overwork. And also, he keeps working in places that are clearly taboo for humanity. He's digging into graves, he's digging into carnal houses, and there he is exploring things that, sure, they're science, but it's such a dark kind of look that clearly he is making complex and poor moral choices in the pursuit of this. Another big red flag, other than, his deteriorating health, is the fact that he more or less cuts off his family. Now, he's already been away from them for some years, and yet he still communicated with them readily by writing them letters back and forth. At this point, however, he becomes less and less communicative with them. And that's clearly connected with the trend of separation from your close friends leading to a darker and darker path. At the end of chapter 4, he out and out admits this. He says, "I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to the rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting the human mind." These passionate excesses stem from a separation from the love of his friends and family. And that's what's going to ultimately lead to his destruction. But this isn't the last we've heard about the need for love of friends and family. This theme definitely will continue throughout the entire book. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe or to follow my link to my Patreon page where you can find more resources on this book and on other works of literature. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.